Good evening and welcome to the TNT Show. It's my pleasure as host of the show for the next 60 minutes to welcome you to what I am sure you'll agree with me is going to be a fascinating discussion. Tonight we have Martyn Day, who will be talking about his experience of what happens to an MP when they're not successful in being re-elected, and a whole raft of SNP MPs found themselves in that position. So how does one feel? What is the impact on family and friends, on your staff? What do you do about offices, for example? Because if you're an effective MP, as Martyn was, where you've set up a whole raft of a range of different facilities to try and best respond to the needs of your constituents. What happens when that suddenly comes to an end? And I know you've all read the stuff about, MPs, once they lose their seats, get this huge chunk of money and all the rest of it. You know, the reality is that there's a whole bunch of other issues out there, which some people might regard as good and more important than sort of easy headlines about, compensation arrangements that may or may not be. Well, as we say every week, it's been a great day for British democracy, if that's not an oxymoron, a bit like business ethics or military intelligence. There's all sorts of stuff happening that you wouldn't have believed. It looks, on the face of it, to every intelligent observer, except perhaps a few people inside BBC Scotland, that the Labour Party, particularly the Labour Party in Scotland, told the most enormous whoppers in order to convince people to vote for them. Now, whether that actually produced sufficient of a change is a moot point, and some research would need to be done to establish the specifics. But nonetheless, looking at the sort of overall figures, it would suggest that the theme of change and a commitment to look after old people, children, and pensioners, as well as the sick, all these commitments must have had some effect. But whatever happened, the reality is that as soon as they were elected, in fact, within a few days of being elected, the Labour Party has abandoned many of these pledges, and in fact has launched what some people might regard as a full-scale attack on many people's living standards. Now, I guess their hope in doing so is that when they come up for re-election in a number of years' time, they will benefit from people's amnesia that the Tories found very helpful when they were in power over a long period of time. I'm not so sure that's going to work quite as well for the Labour Party, but who knows? By the way, the latest joke on Twitter is that the Scottish Labour MPs have now been labelled Los Polos Hermanos. And for those of you who are not fans of Breaking Bad, that is Spanish for the chicken brothers, and sisters, because chicken they have been. So enough of all that. Let's get down to brass tacks, and let's introduce Martyn Day, formerly MP for Bathgate and Linlithgow. Martyn, how are you?
I'm not bad. Yes, I've found myself with the strange phenomenon of being at home for such an extracted period that I can't remember when I was last sleeping in my own bed for as long. And that doesn't mean I've had an exciting other life. It just means I've been on the road too many times, I think. So
fill us in on all the changes that happen as a result of what's happened to you. That the election result happened. We can talk about your feelings about that prior to that, but then you were confronted with the fait accompli. What do you do then? Because you've got all these responsibilities.
Yeah, well, I sent out my last clarion call to members and supporters the few days before the election with a message that basically said, this time next week I will be in London. I'll either be re-establishing myself as your MP for the next 5 years, or I'll be clearing out my office for the next Labour incumbent who will not be doing any of the things we want, basically. So if you want the change we want to see, real change with independence, you need to get out and work for it. Now, it is a binary choice, and it went the wrong way for us on a big scale, right across the whole central belt. So it was a massive swing. I don't think it was anything any of us could have done locally. I think, in fairness, nationally, I don't think there was anything John Swinney could have done with the limited time he had at the helm before we had the election.
Yeah.
But we've got an awful lot of work to do in a very short period of time to make sure we turn this around for the Scottish elections in 2026 and get independence back on track. What it means for those of us in that position is that basically you are absolutely knackered with a campaign. We were burning out every hour we had, and I was doing 3 sessions a day on the doors between 6 and 7 hours, and then I was going back home and doing the admin stuff, responding to emails. I'm pleased to say in this case there were, and this might be an interesting factor for analysts to look at later, there were significantly fewer campaign emails this time than there were in 2019. I haven't added them up, but I would say back of a fag packet we had about 700, which takes a fair bit of effort. And if 3 people write to you on an issue, it takes the same length of time to write a response as it does for 500 folk writing on the issue. So 2019 we had probably nearer 3,000, and that's a very different. Now, whether it was the holidays, folk had other things, or folk had just was totally scunnered with politics and weren't taking part, or had decided how they were voting, multiple factors in there I think we need to think about. So what it means as an individual, you're completely knackered, is you have to return to London, because as a sitting member you had an office, and your parliamentary office on the estate had to be emptied out by the Thursday. And I have to say, returning to London knackered, even to go down to swear in, was probably the last thing any of us really wanted to do in that situation. So I got myself on a train down to London on the Saturday night, blitzed the parliamentary office over the Sunday and Monday, boxed stuff up that could be moved, binned stuff I didn't think I would ever need, or definitely didn't need, and left the paltry amount of stationery I had on the desk for collection, along with and I kept a note of the asset tags of the equipment, by the way, because you have to account for all the parliamentary equipment. So the stuff that was left in the office, I know which asset tags those are, and I know which ones I've got in my office in Bathgate that need to go back as well, so I can match up the spreadsheet. So all that sort of minutiae gets dealt with. And of course, not everybody did what I do. I rented a flat at Parliament, how it gives you a budget for accommodation. Some people prefer hotels. I never liked the hotel lifestyle. I much prefer being able, if you could see the other side of this laptop, you'd see how messy the desk is across from me in the living room. I like to leave stuff at the back of myself and just can carry on where I've left off. So hotels was never the thing for me. So I had a flat fairly close to Parliament. I'm pleased to say the last couple of years within budget. In previous years it was over budget, and that comes out your own pocket. But this was within budget, a great location. So I've got, gave the notice on the lease, obviously, the day after the election. We have a 2-month break clause, so I need to be out of there by the 4th of September. I've got 3/4 of it packed up on the trip I did down to the office, and I'll go back and do the rest and deal with the utility bills and cancel the council tax and things. So, and the similar practice happens at home, because you've got your office. Now, I didn't keep any staff in London, so all my staff were based in Bathgate, and a mixture of part-timers and full-time staff. So I've done all the redundancy letters. We've had meetings, consultation meetings with staff for an inevitable redundancy that you cannot provide them with an alternative job. So there's nothing really to negotiate other than setting a notice period. So that's now been done. Staff are working through that period, winding up. We're now not doing any casework, obviously, but we are returning files and things to people if they want them, and redacting electronic documents for sending back. So there's a bit of work in that, and the bit of work in just getting rid of the equipment and stuff. Now, parliamentary stuff goes back to Parliament, so we need to arrange for that to happen. Contracts need cancelled, so we're doing that just now, and hopefully there's a seamlessness between the power being switched off and the equipment going back before the building gets handed back to the landlord, and then the few remaining staff will be working from home on final wind-up stuff. The headache's going to be, there might be other headaches that I find out over the next couple of weeks. But the headache's going to be getting rid of pretty decent office desks, because I don't think there's a second-hand market for that. So if there's anybody watching that has a requirement for an office desk, and I'm talking pretty decent quality desks, we'll have 5 of them, and swivel chairs which are in great condition, that wants it, well, give me a shout, because otherwise it's going to have to get paid. Somebody's going to be paid to take it to a skip, and actually seems a shame with perfectly good stuff, but
it does. Well, the other thing too is that, I mean, charities are always looking for office equipment.
Are they? I've not found any yet, so.
Because I know that when I was involved in charities, it was always a pain in the tonsils, because we had desks with 3 legs and stuff like this. And
all right. Oh, we've got decent stuff, bought in 2015 when we moved in, 9-year-old, but in most of it in extremely good condition.
Yeah.
Obviously there isn't any computer equipment that goes back to the Parliament.
Sure.
But there's desks and chairs, and
Does that include the computer equipment you were using in Scotland?
Oh yes, yeah. Basically,
that's owned by the estate, the Crown Parliament estate.
There's 3 sort of criteria. There's the stuff that is digital services own equipment, and has to go back to them. There's the stuff that's done as kind of rental, so it's theirs. The stuff we buy from them, and if it's within 5 years, we get to keep it. If it's over 5 years, we get to keep it. If it's within 5 years, it goes back to them because it's still usable. And all our equipment's in that category. I mean, we're not using any antique stuff. And then there's stuff that we bought through the office budget, and anything over £500, which basically is any kind of decent laptop that you're buying, goes back to them, unless you opt to pay a sort of depreciation straight line method. And I have to say that doesn't reflect market value on second-hand computer equipment. So I'd be surprised if folk did that.
I'd be surprised. I mean, I can hear all the conspiracy theorists in the background saying, hold on a second, how secure were your communications if you're using equipment supplied by the Westminster estate? I mean, could they tap into it any time?
Well, I think the parliamentary services are pretty good. I think they've probably had a lot more security features than elsewhere has.
No, I was thinking about parliamentary services tapping into your...
Well, I suppose they would have that. I mean, the issue I had was occasionally getting stuff filtered out, but as suspicious, and then you get the email the day later, so you've got this delay on some stuff that you have to then decide, I'll accept that, I know who that's coming from.
So they were monitoring your emails?
I think it's more of an automated monitoring system than a physical.
However it's done, it doesn't sound, I mean, it sounds, on the face of it, the Constitution, if I can use that term ever so loosely about the UK, you would think there'd be constitutional safeguards that required an MP's correspondence and communications to be sacrosanct.
You would hope that, and that would be the principle that.
Gracious, that's a scary thing. Even if it's an algorithm, why have an algorithm?
Well,
why would you have an algorithm for one thing and not for lots of other things?
I think you probably do need that on the basis that people are, put it bluntly, stupid, and they click inappropriate links and stuff in emails, and therefore all sorts of things get onto their systems, and then the bigger threat. So
I suppose that's right. Yeah, I can see why. It's so easy to introduce a virus nowadays.
And people fall for it. And parliamentarians are an obvious target because they have so much information and access to people that's just the necessary evil. I mean, one of the things I still don't to this day know who I upset when I first got to Westminster, because in 2015, for the first 2 years, they stuck me on the admin committee, which is the most boring select committee in the entire Parliament. But you do get to know how the nuts and bolts of the place work, which my staff loved because they found out so much quicker than everybody else how things operated. So that there was some advantages. There wasn't any advantage to me having to be there every Monday afternoon for a really boring meeting that was in camera. But one of the things we did do was visit the top secret mail screening facility. And that gave me the willies early on, because when you saw the level of security that was put through mail sent to Parliament, I thought, oh my God, my staff are opening mail in the office in Bathgate and none of it's getting through this system. So I got everything redirected to go through that. And because the last thing you want is responding to something after an incident. Thankfully, we never had any incidents. We had a couple of false calls with people had just sent very strangely packaged things.
Oh my.
Right, but nothing serious, nothing threatening at all. It was just the way we packaged it, caused some concern. So
no white powder and stuff like that.
No, very strangely packaged Jiffy envelopes with odd sets of documents that people wanted me to read at great length, and from some very friendly people who thought I'd done a great job for them, Nugget. And Nugget really upset them at the screening centre, I have to say. So,
really, it is weird.
We did get to eat it eventually, but
for my sins, I came through Gatwick Airport a couple of weeks ago there at a weekend, and holy moly, what a mess! Everybody's brother was going on holiday, and I picked up this. I don't know if you can see it. I got because somebody pushed me over on the escalator in order to get to their flight in time. Most of the flights that late were oversubscribed, which means that there has to be this discussion at the gate about, no, your friend can fly, but you can't. However, here's 50 quid, and hopefully you're happy with that. But crazy. I mean, and going through security was just weird. It was just weird. I mean, I was almost down to my underwear.
Oh, I've been there. I have been there. Coincidentally, it was the week after I'd put in an objection to the Edinburgh airspace consultation. So you hope the two things are completely you do wonder, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I do believe in cock up more than anything else, but yeah.
Well, it's hard not to be apprehensive when you're in these situations. So we've got a bunch of questions, but the thrust of them I'll come to in a second, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll forgive me, because I want to cover a few things. So you're sitting there, your campaign's underway. You didn't expect it, I suspect, unless you're going to tell me otherwise, that you got inside information, or you, like the Tory staff, you placed this £1,000 bet on the election. I assume you had no inkling that this was going to happen.
Well, if anyone from Rishi Sunak's office had tipped me off that it was going to be an election then, I'd have thought they were winding me up, because it made no sense whatsoever to do it then. And, that was obviously what transpired. It definitely didn't make any sense. We knew from the doors that it was going to be a much tougher contest than the previous ones we'd fought.
Yeah.
So there was no surprise there.
But why, Martyn? Because you've got a situation where the Scottish government, despite its critics, I mean, if you look at the bare facts, the Scottish government has done a lot of good for people in Scotland, no question about that. It may have been presented otherwise in the media, but the reality, as opposed to the fiction, is clear. They've done lots of things for the Scottish people. You would think that some of that, plus the efforts that the MPs have made at Westminster, would combine to make your vote resilient to some degree.
You would hope that, but I think Scottish politics is just extremely volatile, and I think people are too easily swayed by the media and a whole range of factors that they see from that. If we think of 2019, which is was a really good year for us, after 2017, which was also not a good year for us, but 2019, the media gave us a pretty easy ride. They were extremely hostile to Corbyn. Corbyn was the demon, and anyone that was fighting Labour had it dead easy. In fact, it was so easy the Tories came second to me. That was where we were. This time round, that wasn't the case. The media was all very positive towards Labour. They were extremely hostile to everybody that was non-Labour. So we didn't get that protection that we got when they were shooting at someone else. They were shooting at us, and they definitely did our opponents were successful at manipulating the way people saw how our government had performed here, and we were tarred in with a negative vibe. We also created some of the problems, I think, if we're being honest, for ourselves. I don't think changing leader twice was helpful. I think all of that created a bit of uncertainty and allowed these negative vibes to be amplified, and they certainly were. And then on top of that, there was just this massive big feeling of people wanting rid of the Tories. And, we were then in the classic squeezed out situation. Now, I can apply logic, but then I'm a political anorak, and it made no logic to switch from the SNP to Labour to get rid of the Tories when you had a non-Tory MP. But that's not how your average person was sitting, watching dumbed down TV or, probably not reading any newspapers, but that's not how they saw it. They just saw it as they were being part of this big movement to get rid of the Tories, and they were voting in a government, and that's always the classic squeeze situation that we'll be in. John Swinney said something, and I can't remember the exact words he used after the election. We were still in shell shock as to the scale of it, but it was something that gave me a bit of encouragement. He made a comment at the press call, basically along the lines that we didn't make the urgency of independence to people, relevant enough. And that's, I think, where we need to be. We've got to make it relevant to everybody's everyday lives. We all know the issues people were concerned about with the cost of living, and we have to tie it in with that. And we were right to be highlighting the risks to further austerity to come, and that's been proven, in spades, in a few short weeks. I'm now using the mantra that people have been shortchanged, and I think every time Labour fail to deliver on something, I'm going to be echoing that shortchange.
Excellent.
That's a good riposte to their change mantra that they used at the election very successfully. And I think that's just where we were.
Did the party do any studies, polling ahead of time, focus groups, etc., to ascertain what the pressure points were? Because what you've just told me, sounds entirely credible. It makes so much sense to me. But I wonder if there perhaps were some undercurrents that could have been addressed that would have ameliorated some of the media coverage. And you would only know that if you'd actually asked people in advance.
There certainly was work done. Now, we got the occasional briefing. We didn't see detailed work on it, but we got occasional briefing. We knew early on that there were issues. We knew there were issues at the beginning, more so in the kind of more new build kind of areas. Traditional areas were holding firmer. Towards the end of the campaign, that wasn't the case, and I can tell you that from the ballot boxes. Our challenge, I suppose, is to work out just where our vote went, because it was a huge turnaround in vote. Some of them stayed at home. A lot of them did, I think. Some of them went to Labour. We need to work out which scale of that. And then, of course, there was all the other churnage happening between the Tory votes that were going to Reform and to Labour. There were Liberal votes going to Labour. There was, a lot happening there that was quite unique. And obviously, the scale of what happened can be turned on its head and can be reversed, because if it can be done one way, it can be done another. Indeed, the scale of turnaround is probably about half of what we turned around in 2015. So it's, put it in perspective, we've done that on a bigger scale before, so we can do this, but we've got to get our act together. And there's a whole range of things there. There's the public perception of how our government's performing in Edinburgh. We need to get that part right, and we weren't always there. We've all said for years we need a swift rebuttal unit, and we don't have that mechanism really in place. We need to get our campaign organisation in place, and I think around much of the country our organisation is not in a good shape. I would say in my own area it could be in a better shape, but we, to give you an example, I don't think this is a state secret, but we canvassed over 10,000 people during the campaign, which was pretty good on the doors. We have canvassed more than that in other elections. In 1999, the first Scottish Parliament election, when Stuart Stevenson was the candidate and I was the agent, we clocked up about 22,000 contacts, which was massively more. we did a lot of phone canvassing on that occasion. We didn't have the capacity for doing phone canvassing because of numbers and stuff like that this time. So we need to get our act together where we can do. Also, there's less phone numbers to phone, even if you had the numbers. But we've got to get.
Well, I mean, that's electronic media of a fairly primitive kind. Nowadays, we've got electronic media of a more sophisticated kind.
Oh yeah, micro-targeting and everything. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I suspect the presidential campaign will be one on TikTok.
Yeah, I need to get more into TikTok. I started during lockdown doing videos, and they've gradually improved. They could still go a long way, I think, but gradually I've got better. I mean, the initial ones, if anyone wants a laugh, should look back at the ones I did in the first period of lockdown, because I started with hello, and if you do that, you just sound like you're doing a poor Ricky Fulton sketch. It's not the intro you want to go. So I now go in a bit more quicker and try and make them a bit more different. But I haven't done any since before the election, update vlogs, but I'm going to start them again because I think I've got a commentary in the style that I can fine tune and just an audience that we can still reach. And we've got to make sure people in my position,
I think that's right. I mean, the key to all of this, it seems to me, is good, solid research to establish what is it people want to see. And I think you quite correctly pointed out what they wanted to see this time around was the end of the Tories, and they were prepared to do pretty much anything to get rid of the Tories. It didn't help that the broadcast media confused devolved issues and Westminster issues. But then again, that's a problem that should have been dealt with many years ago. I mean, because this didn't happen overnight. What happened was that the broadcast media are going through a torrid time. I mean, the BBC is talking about getting rid of 500 people. I suspect few of those will leave from Scotland, but maybe they deserve to, but they won't. I think it's protected. But the other media are not protected. In other words, they depend, unlike the BBC, on sales. Either you're selling time or you're not selling time. And if you're not selling time, you don't have a job. That's not, the BBC can afford to ignore all of these realities. But at the same time, they can't afford to disregard the reality that if you can't reach your audience, then the audience will disappear. And I've got a headline from, where is it now? This is the Times, July 12th, 23. And it just says, I'm not sure you can read it there, but essentially what it says is that BBC Scotland audiences collapsed since the pandemic. Now that's a disaster. If you've got an employer who's already said to you, we have to reduce costs, and most employers will tell you that at some stage. Hey guys, we have to get rid of some bodies here. You just can't, you're not producing. So far, BBC Scotland has been largely immune, but I noticed also that the head of BBC Scotland is moving on and going back to Northern Ireland. So I suppose that's indicative of being jumping before you're pushed. But nonetheless, I suspect it will continue to decline. The reality is how one deals with that decline.
Yeah.
And whether one treats the media environment as hostile, or one treats it as it's approachable, and to be able to be convinced. I think increasingly, some people might say that the party's approach was somewhere in between. In other words, let's be kind, let's not antagonize anyone, let's not upset anyone. Whereas the reality is sometimes you do have to step on toes if you want to get things changed. And I think when the electorate see an environment where things are not happening the way they would expect, they expect somebody to be firm and assertive. And I think if you don't provide that assertion in politics, it can be very, very, very difficult. The environment is then created that you're continually having to push the rock up the hill when your opponents are busy rolling it down, sometimes on top of you. So it's the labours of Sisyphus if you don't get these fundamentals in place. And some people would say, look, the party in Scotland has had many, many years to sort this out.
Yes, we have. It's been a problem we've identified a long time ago, but we've never quite got the answer to it. And I watched the news last night, and I can't remember what the full part of the story was. It was more it was international stuff I was watching to do with India. As you might know, my partner's from India, so we
I remember well.
We keep a tab on what's happening over there on a regular basis. But it was and I'm not even sure which channel we were watching, but it was one of the UK channels interviewing one of the BJP spokespeople, and obviously BJP is the government, and there was the aftermath of their election and being in a weaker position. Now, the guy's responses were to a large extent bollocks, being brutally honest, but it was his approach that I was quite intrigued with, because he was quite combative and was challenging the journalist for how he was framing his questions.
Yeah.
And I thought, now in his case, I thought, well, he's not got any answers, but he's just preaching his own choir. But I thought, maybe we need to see a bit more of that kind of approach from some of our people.
Absolutely.
So we could have been answering questions, but also highlighting that kind of approach. And I thought, right, there's some lessons there for us.
There's a lot of. I mean, it's all about setting the right environment.
Yeah.
And please don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that it's easy to do this, but I'm suggesting that something constructive and, dare I say, assertive needs to happen. The reason I say it's not easy is because uniquely, the BBC in Scotland doesn't report to anyone in Scotland. It reports to an administration in London. And even if it lost its entire audience in Scotland, it would remain unaffected. I mean, that's the reality of it. It does not answer to the market it serves, and that is unique. I mean, most broadcasters have to answer to the audience, but uniquely, BBC Scotland answers to another entity, which is very, very odd indeed. So you can produce your audience, you can mislead your audience, and there is no feedback, but there's certainly no rectification, and there's no need for rectification if you get things wrong. And they get things wrong consistently and continually, and that's what happens when you don't have a feedback loop. I mean, if I'm doing this and I keep making mistakes, then people stop watching and they stop listening, and that's the way things should be, because I'm not up to scratch, and why should people put up with it? But it seems to me that BBC Scotland is immune to all of that. I've said this in my Sunday National columns repetitively, but that's the reality of it. And somebody somewhere needs to address that, and ASAP. And there's a period now between now and the next Scottish election where it would be, seems to me, to be very appropriate to do that. But I want to turn back to your plans now, Martyn. What do you see yourself doing? Now you've got, I mean, it's great that you've got some more time to spend with the family. That's fantastic, and I'm so pleased for you. But you're not the sort of guy that sits there, sucking his thumb and saying, "Oh, I've no idea." You're not that sort of guy. So what are your plans?
Well, I mean, I'm in my early 50s, and throughout my entire life, I've never really known what I want to do in my life. So I'm one of those folk that will end up doing something. I obviously, I'm nowhere near retirement, so I need to find paid employment of some sort. I have now drafted a CV, the first one I've drafted in 25 years. So I'm going to start looking for things. And that's as a way to pay the bills. But I've always, worked to live rather than, live to work, So my passion has always been my interest in politics and my interest in history and folk music, being the other parts. And I've added photography and videography to that as a result of lockdown and the things I've learned. So I've got plenty of interest to do. Obviously, I've got a skill set and I've got a knowledge base and I've got a fair bit of equipment because I've been doing stuff. So I'm definitely going to do more live streams. I'm going to do more recorded vlogs and just see where it takes us. I've spoken with a couple of my. So if people don't know, I as an MP, I was doing roughly a weekly update as to what had happened, and I tried to keep them down to below 3 minutes if I could. So it was just short and succinct and things that week and how I'd voted and stuff like that. So I now don't need to report on how I voted, or give a summary of what I spoke on that week, because we weren't really in control of what happened. We just responded to things. So I can now keep that going, but comment on the issues as I see them, as and when I think appropriate, which will be an interesting and more enjoyable discipline to do. So I'll do that. And the other thing I'm going to do is we started doing a few live streams, which we'd done from Parliament, myself and John McNally. And what I'm keen to do is continue doing that with more sort of in-depth discussions. I've spoken to a couple of my former colleagues. So we've got a couple of people agreeing in principle to do them. But what I want to try and do is combine, and this will add an extra challenge, but since I'm at home more, I'll be able to do this, is do them as traditional town hall meetings that are also live streamed, because I think it would be nice to engage more with the actual community that we're trying to work with and show that we're alive, well, and reach a wider audience at the same time. So that's, and of course I've not stopped knocking doors. I've been out a couple of times already in the constituency chapping doors. We have a council by-election in the Armadale ward coming up on the 22nd of August. So we've got a good and active candidate there. I don't think he's released the campaign video we did for him. I filmed one on Friday night last week with him. So if you keep your eye out for that, you might get a wee smile, because I get to do the fun behind the camera as well. So I won't spoil the video, but we've done a couple of special effect tricks which I think are quite effective. So
cool. And you've got the whole podcast environment as well. You've got that whole universe there. It's endless. And I mean, increasingly people don't, dare I say, get jobs anymore. What happens is they create jobs. I mean, that's really what AI and the rest of it's all about. It's about accepting that the traditional route that we were used to in the past, and I'm much older than you, by the way, it's no longer here to the same degree that it once was. And so therefore it has been replaced by people who are fleet of foot and technologically savvy. And so what they can do is what was impossible in the past. They could have TikTok, they could have podcasts, all done, from the safety and comfort of their own home, as it were, but reaching out to disparate audiences.
Yeah.
And it was not to see it as one big lump of people, but rather to say, just like marketing people do, subdivide them.
So it's such a changed environment. I mean, I remember doing my first flyers in the 1990s, and we were still doing old style cut and paste on typewriters, and putting photos on and then handing this pasted together thing to a printer to get the most god awful looking thing back. And an A5 flyer took you a week to do. Now you'd knock it up in 20 minutes on your computer, and it would look 10 times better than anything we did. Back then we still thought, this looks great, and we had two typewriters. We had a portable one that had a smaller font size, so we could have two sizes of fonts. We thought this was great, chronically embarrassing when we look back now and you think, how did we? But that's where we've came from, and there are some disciplines in it that were quite helpful, I suppose, because you thought how to lay something out before you did it, and you forced yourself to be succinct. Which I think, some of the modern generation can be too verbose. Although theoretically they have lower attention spans than us older folk have, they just start writing and they don't stop, whereas we...
Well, I'll tell you what, there are some great parallels here. I've just finished a book on Benjamin Franklin. And you probably know that Benjamin left home when he was 16 because he just couldn't get on with his parents and stuff, and ended up as one of the founding fathers. And that period of excellence included time as the US ambassador in Paris, where his liaisons were more than literary, it would seem. But he charmed the ladies. But he started off as a printer's apprentice, and discovered that one of the keys when he got enough capital to produce his own material was to stimulate the market by writing his own letters of disapproval. In other words, this is a fine publication, but it's high time the following interests were properly represented. So he was his own critic. And of course, by filling the paper full of that, it reached out to a bunch of people who were only vaguely interested, because every week they would grab a copy of the paper to see what vituperative stuff had been written by this critic the week before. So he learned to manipulate the media when he was 17, 18, which says something. But we all have slightly interesting origins, I suppose, when it comes right down to it. I want to ask a question, if I may, Martyn, about people are asking, what about a constitutional convention? Is that something you'd be interested in contributing to?
I think we need to do something to bring the Yes movement together. I mean, I think that is, a very important part of the process. The SNP will always be the main engine driving independence, in my opinion. But we need to bring everybody as far as we can into the tent, because we're not going to do it on our own. And we've got to just find a way of engaging with more of the public than we possibly can. And I was fighting, as I say, there was an election, right? And we spoke to more than 10,000 people out of 70,000. So that's 1 in 7. And that was short conversations in the heat of a campaign. So, we needed to do 7 times that to speak to everybody. We needed to do 30 times that to have a meaningful conversation with everybody, and that's the kind of scale we need. So we need a lot more people. And it's, it's more than just traditional doorstep stuff. It's social media, it's speaking to people at community groups. It's every way that we can interact, So we need everybody doing the bit and amplifying. And I say this often, and I hope the attitude's there to spread this kind of approach. Is we should not, none of us in the Yes movement should be shooting at other Yesers.
For sure.
When we disagree, we should pick up the phone or send a private message or have our offline. But we should be, if we don't agree, just say nothing or emphasize on a point. But we shouldn't be seen as arguing with each other, because I think that just puts the public off and they just see squabble.
They see squabble. I'm not sure how much squabbling they actually see. I think a lot of it is sort of part of the political community, but not necessarily terribly well known outside. But there'll be the odd thing that suddenly appears in the papers that looks very awkward and untoward. But I think the way around that is certainly to have some sort of constitutional convention where all the groups can come together and there's a focus on independence and the arrangements for achieving that. And this is not rocket science. I mean, so many countries have travelled this route before. I mean, anyone who's opened a history book can say, look, there's no God-given right for a party like the SNP always to be the main player. You have to understand that history treats parties that don't deliver very harshly indeed. And that happened in Ireland and it happened elsewhere. So, you have to be, I mean, the BJP, I don't think existed terribly long ago, but not in the form it is now, with this sort of rather far-right approach to politics, perhaps. Maybe I'm being unfair to them. I apologise if I am. But it seems to me that a constitutional convention would be hugely important and highly desirable to enable people to get together. And I can ask you a question on that subject. When I interviewed Stephen Flynn before the election, I asked Stephen, can you tell me who's in charge within the party of making sure that the Constitutional Convention, which is party policy, happens? Who's in charge of it? And he said, I'll get back to you because I don't know. And I'm still waiting.
Yep, that's a good question. It just needs somebody to drive it, to be honest. I respect.
Well, why isn't it being driven by the First Minister?
Yeah, perhaps it could be. Yeah, I mean,
or maybe it should be driven by the head of the party at Westminster. I don't know, but it seems to be some high-profile figure needs to take hold of this and run with it and give it that imprimatur that says, "Look, this is hugely important to us."
Yeah, no, I would agree wholeheartedly. We have to reach out to our fellow travellers and work where we have common ground, because if we don't, we're not going to get there. And the whole point is diversity actually can be strength, because we don't all need to be singing on the same page. We just need to be pushing in the same general direction and have a multitude of approaches as to how we get there, and there's room for everybody. Is my
couldn't
approach.
agree more. I couldn't agree more. I mean, when I look at the, every single mistake I was prevented from making in business was because somebody in the meeting said, I'm not sure about this. And something that saved my bacon. So I can't tell you how often it saved my bacon. And I discovered that if you didn't encourage people to speak up and you didn't seek, I would truly mean this, didn't seek diversity amongst all your team, you were sadly missing out. And I think that's, when I look at the Labour Party now, I see the same nonsense that I was encouraged as a young manager to get involved in, which is to have a whole bunch of people who spoke and thought like me.
Yeah.
And where I had complete and utter control over everything they did. Absolutely nonsense. I mean, just arrant nonsense. You need people to say, I'm sorry. that's just, I can't see that working. and you go back and you think about it and you think, God damn it. How come I didn't see that? But it's all about asking the questions.
Yes. Yeah. And be willing to consider. You don't have to agree, but you have to just do that thought check. Is this right? Have I got that the right way? And you might decide, yeah, I've definitely got that right, but you've paused. You've paused before you press the button.
What's it the bard said? And prevented many a foolish notion.
Aye.
Well, it sounds to me like you've got a real handle on things, because not everyone responds as well as you clearly have to adversity. It's the mark of the man, really.
Well, I was
not to work well when things are going well, but to work well when things aren't.
I mean, I was a political activist before, any of us were elected, when we had 3 MPs and 60 odd councillors. And then, I got elected to the council. And the running joke back then was that the first person asked made up the policy. We've came a long way from, how sort of shoestring and amateur-ish we really were as a movement back then. So we've seen it, through the tough days when you had to really fight for every vote and every to get a council win was seen as an advance. And, I'm not going to stop being an activist because the job's not done. We are not yet independent, and there's a huge amount of work that needs pulled together. I think one of the tragedies of the 9 years that we were at Westminster, well, there's probably two. Firstly, I think 2015, we had this massive uplift on the back of the referendum, and then we lost through election so many of our experienced hands, either as MPs or staffers, and it deprived this burgeoning new movement that we had of the local leadership that was required. So in an ironic way, we hamstrung ourselves a bit there. And then to compound that, this is the second part, we never really worked out what to do with a parliamentary group at Westminster. And I think even to this day, we still haven't worked that out. And I think that's one of the great tragedies, is that we've now lost that opportunity. I know what we should have been doing, in my opinion, is that we should have been tasked with going away and just drafting parts of the prospectus for independence, things on defence, foreign policy, things that we had suddenly access to that we hadn't had before, and that would have been worthwhile and meaningful. And of course, we had in those days a huge amount of short money and staff support that we could have had research done and things. So we missed out on that. We were playing the hamster wheel approach of Westminster politics and just being very busy but not achieving an awful lot.
Would you go far as to say that you, not you personally, but collectively, became institutionalized?
I don't think we did collectively. No, I think almost everybody kept their feet on the ground. I think we were just caught up in the bubble and having to be there for important votes that might happen and didn't happen, and that wasn't the best use of our time. And because we were third party, we had automatic replies to questions and statements that we had to cover. We also had places on every select committee. Now, the one advantage of, and this is, there's not many advantages to losing 39 seats in an election. But the one advantage is that we're now not the third party, which means our guys can be a lot more guerrilla in their approach as to what they pick to fight on. Their opportunities to speak will be less, but they don't have to be there covering committees and every statement.
Isn't there a broader point here, though, which is that while you may not have become institutionalised, nonetheless, when you participate in an institution, you effectively have to support its overall aims, i.e., it seems to me the overall aim of Westminster primarily is its continuance.
Yeah.
Well, in other words, as majorly unimpeded as possible. In other words, we want to continue being here. We want to make as few changes as we possibly can. And in being part of it, you support that purpose, as it were.
I don't think we ever supported that, but I think we were drawn into the pointlessness of the hamster wheel. I mean, there's the old joke that if you want something to be a secret, make a speech about it in the House of Parliament.
Yeah.
It's that kind of thing. It's removed from the ordinary people. What Westminster does is it sucks the most radical people in the whole country, puts them into one location and keeps them away from the public that they could actually radicalise and stir up. And that's the big downside to it. And
I think that's what I mean by its purpose is its continuance, regardless of how its functioning is not important to it. Its purpose is to continue the way it is, as unchanged as possible, but to make the odd concession that makes it look as if it's responsive.
Yeah, I read a book later on during the lockdown period when I finally got time to read stuff after the initial deluge. But I bought a history on the Russian Revolution, after its centenary, and there was a bit in there about Lenin's State and Revolution pamphlet that he wrote. And I can't remember the exact wording, but the gist of it was he denounced the English Parliament and the other European parliaments as talking shops to confuse the ordinary people.
Yeah.
And in those days, over a century ago, MPs probably had more power and clout than MPs do today to influence things. So, and it's even more of a talking shop now. So I think that just sums up if we want change, we're going to have to grasp it for ourselves and do it, And
I think so. And to point out the differences in principle, it seems to me that never ever happened. I mean, I campaigned long and hard for a constitution for Scotland, and eventually it seemed to me it happened eventually largely through Mike Russell perhaps, and thanks to him for doing that. But it was a flaccid response. I mean, the document appeared, but there was no real impetus behind it, and it seems to be that missed a trick because the UK constitution is so badly flawed that anything juxtaposed is bound to look absolutely fantastic. And so if you produce one that is absolutely fantastic, the gap between the two is so blatantly clear that nobody would ever support the former.
Yeah, well, just as an example of how apparent it is to people from outside is one of my partner's nieces visited, and when she was in London, we took her in to see the Houses of Parliament, and we took her around a bit, and we took her into the visitors' gallery in the Lords. And this young girl hadn't been outside Kerla prior to that, and was 17, 18 years old. And she asked me, "Who are they?" and pointed to the bishops that were sitting there. And I said, "That's the Anglican bishops." And then she asked me the next most sensible question that anyone can ask: "Well, why are they there?"
Exactly.
And that's a great question. Why are any of them there? There shouldn't be any unelected people, but we're the only supposed democracy in the world that has unelected clerics in its government, apart from Iran, and that's not a good example to hold yourself.
Well, I know in Iran's case, you're absolutely right. But I mean, who would want to be compared? But the reality is that they're there and they will continue to be there.
Yeah.
Because the Labour Party pledged 100 years ago to abolish the House of Lords. Not only haven't they done so, they've actually more recently appointed people.
Yeah.
In order to equalise things up. You think, this is nonsense. This is a bit like saying, I'm in favour of abolishing slavery, but you know something, I have these slaves which I'm prepared to sell you. You think, what nonsense is this? You're either in favour of abolishing it
Or not, aye.
or you're not. It's like being half pregnant. I mean, this is nonsense. And
Yeah.
yet nobody says, oh, look, this is nonsense. It's like the emperor with no clothes.
Yeah.
You're looking at this character stark naked, and you read the public prints and they're saying, actually, this guy's a fine, outstanding individual. And you say, no, he's stark naked. The whole world can see he's stark naked. Your relative can see he's stark naked. Anyway, we started to say. But I mean, Martyn, we've only got about 5 minutes left, and I want to leave some time, as I always do, for you to say a few things that you feel haven't been covered tonight and you would really like to get some points across. So feel free, whatever you feel that you would like to cover in the 5 minutes we have that we haven't covered already.
I think the message that, for me, that gives me some comfort, and maybe some of the others that maybe haven't thought of this would get comfort from, but also our support base, is that there's different types of power. And I remember Billy Wolfe explaining this, that there's elected power and there's unelected power. You have to use whatever power you have. And as a body politic, we have a lot of power if we act in unison, act together. And I don't think the average member of the public realises how much power they have if they actually use it and wield it. And the trick to that is we shouldn't be playing Westminster's games. We need to, play our own games, as it were, establish what we want to do and just get people behind that. We've got to use the phrase I was probably misquoting John Swinney on, but we need to make independence, the urgency of it, much more relevant to the average man in the street, and it has to be tied into the issues that matter to them. So it's not some abstract concept, and we mustn't be seen arguing about process, because the average punter couldn't care less what the process is. And to be honest with you, and I'm an old dyed-in-the-wool independentist, I couldn't care which process we use to get there, as long as we get there, but to get there we've got to convince more people that that's where we want to go. And once we do that, I think the dominoes just start falling in the right order for us. So
I agree with you, and one of the reasons I mentioned the convention was I was thinking back to the days of devolution, and I was thinking about Kenyon right. And all the parties got together, except, of course, for the SNP, because independence wasn't on the agenda. But devolution was. And it was interesting to me that, Kenyon Wright was able to steer that ship through choppy waters in order to reach some conclusions, which eventually resulted in the Scotland Act, which, despite all of its flaws, was an advance.
Yeah.
I think, though, what happened thereafter was the impetus started to leach away. And there should have been then a follow-up once the SNP particularly became successful, and after that, certainly round about the time of the referendum, to say, look, we don't know all the answers here, but let's all get together and talk about our common aim, which is for an independent state, and how we're going to set about achieving that. And I think, bearing in mind that the opinion polls suggested that we're still looking at 50%, that means half the people of Scotland want to see constitutional change of a huge and significant nature, and not just pottering around as sometimes has to happen because of a devolved arrangement. That's what they're seeking, and I suspect they're not hearing anything.
No, I don't think they are. No, and again, we need to. I think one of the attack lines we're going to get is, everything that's wrong with the world, largely caused by Westminster, we get the line, the Scottish Parliament could mitigate this.
Exactly.
And I think we're going to hear a lot more of that. And I think we already do too good a job of mitigating the things that Westminster. So, when you get to the stage where everything needs mitigated, the only answer is independence. And we need to, just spell it out. And, for right or wrong, the vote that Labour got earlier in the month, a substantial number of those voters are independent supporters now. Yeah. So they now have an independence bloc that they're going to need to try and mollify, pacify, keep on side. I can't see how they do that with the line that they're going down.
It's impossible. It's impossible. And they could be looking at an even more complicated environment, because I gather that Plaid Cymru are, according to the polls, running only 1% behind Labour in Wales. And the Irish reunification is certainly on the cards.
Yep.
So once you build in some of these prospective changes, the Constitution has to alter.
Yeah.
And the question is, do you alter it in a way that aligns with the interests of the component parts, or do you say, well, we'll just make up, go along? It's nonsense. It's just nonsense. It's crazy. Martyn, thank you very much. It's been great. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you found it helpful as well. I don't think we've covered anywhere near as many of the bases as we ought to have done, certainly based on the number of questions we've had. And I apologise if your question wasn't asked. Maybe you could come back and we could pick up again and take things forward.
Yeah, always happy to do so. One of the jobs we will have over the next few weeks is the teams, and this will happen right across the country, is we'll go through the marked registers of who voted and who didn't vote, and we'll have a much more interesting insight as to what actually happened in terms of our vote, certainly, once we've done that. And that's one of the stages that we need to do to look at what we do next.
Okay, that's great. Super. Thank you very much, Martyn. If you can stick around for a few seconds once we're through offline. Well, thank you very much, Martyn, and thank you to all of you. Again, my apologies if your question wasn't answered, but we did cover a lot of ground I don't think you would have seen covered anywhere else, frankly, and not with such an articulate interviewee. So let's look forward to seeing you all again next week, next Wednesday, and a big thank you to all of you, and a thank you also to all the people who contributed to Independence Live. We're very grateful to you all. So good night. Take care and see you all next week with another star guest. Good night.